So hey guys, thanks for hanging in there throughout these various sessions. My apologies for chopping it up, but my iPad will only record just so much at a time, so they're going to be in like 30 or 40 minute segments each. We are about to pick up with the story of the Separatists, who will become known as the Pilgrims, and the promised John Smith map, as well as some discussion about the prayer that took place in the choir at the first meeting of the House of Burgesses in 1619. All right, here we go. So we begin with this image of the John Smith map of the Chesapeake area. Guys, he was really remarkable in what he was able to accomplish, and this document is an absolute treasure. It's the most important early map of the Chesapeake area that we have, and it's of course an early 17th century version. What you're looking at here is his original map. Okay, you remember that he's exploring from the time he arrives in 1607 until he returns in the fall of 1609 following the gunpowder accident. He's going to travel 2,500 miles during that time, exploring and mapping. And this is probably one of his greatest contributions, is the information that we have based on his journals and then specifically on this map. So this is the first map I'm going to show you in just a minute, and so it was just going to be an engraving, so it's basically printed in black and white, and then over the years as printers got hold of it and enhanced it, this is a later version, it's a little more fun to look at, so I'm showing you this one, but this still dates from the early 17th century. What you're seeing here, I'm going to zoom in just a little bit, but first I want you to notice the orientation of the map. Which way is north? In order to discover that, we need to look at this compass rose, and we find this often during the early colonial period, that folks will map the areas as they approach them, not necessarily at, we're used to seeing everything on the north-south orientation. So if we look closely here, we see the compass rose pointing north, so this is north, and he has, obviously west is towards the top of this map. And clearly it is a map of Virginia. Probably some of the things that stand out to you immediately are these illustrations. Again, these are really important because they give us some information about what the native peoples looked like, the animals that were in the area at the time, even maybe perhaps at least Smith's perception of the rituals that they were engaging in. So this is an image of Wahun Sonokok, the chief of the Powhatan Confederacy, engaging in some kind of a ritual inside his, like a common house. And it also gives you some idea about the construction of the common house, that this clearly was reeds, so this is not a teepee like we might see out in the plains, but this is a reed structure. So it's a valuable source of information in many areas. Now if we look down here, well, number one, you see the Virginia Mare. So the Virginian Sea, he's calling this, rather than the Atlantic. And then as we enter into the Chesapeake Bay, you see Chesapeake spelled out here. If you look closely out here at the land, he's written in the letters Powhatan to indicate that this whole area is controlled by the Powhatan Confederacy. And then we're going to zoom in a little bit to look at some of these rivers. So I've zoomed into this area, Chesapeake, where the Chesapeake Bay is. And he calls this the Powhatan Flu, because coming from the Latin, Powhatan River. However, we know that's going to be renamed the James, but the local people call it the Powhatan, or he's named it the Powhatan. This is the James River. If we follow it up, you see this little island sticking out here, and we see the fort at Jamestown placed on his map. Also, guys, we can see pretty clearly in this image, if you follow on up and then out this way to the south, this little Greek cross. On the map, there's a legend at the top of the map that illustrates, that this would be a great house, that he'd traveled out this far and there was a great house. But these little crosses, these Greek crosses, indicate the extent of his travels on a particular body of water. Like, this is how far I got. So he got all the way out here, and he indicates the types of structures that he was able to see and confirm were present out this direction. So again, this is such a valuable resource for historians and archaeologists today. I mentioned the James River. This one you can clearly see that the old name, Pamunkey, the Pamunkey River, it'll later be renamed the York River, and all the way up, and you can see he travels all the way out to here where that Greek cross is located. This next one, interesting, he calls this the Stingray Island. Stingray Island is located right here because he had a very memorable encounter with a stingray. He was stung, and that's something you don't forget. So he's going to name this little body of land right here Stingray Island. And then as you travel up this river, you see Tappahannock flew. Later this is going to be called the Rappahannock. So it's going to go from Tappahannock to Rappahannock. This is the Rappahannock River. And then here, if you look closely, Potomac, the Potomac River. And if we follow it out, just as I mentioned in class, all the way up to this Greek cross where he could go no further, he called it the Falls. And this is the present-day location of Washington, D.C. All right, let's skip to the next one. I just want you to see again kind of the overall vision of the map. This is the legend that I mentioned right up here. What types of houses and the extent that he traveled. And then these are the illustrations that were included. Now these illustrations were actually not done by him, but by another man named John White. And John White had previously been the governor of the failed Roanoke colony that the English had attempted to establish back during the reign of Queen Elizabeth. So it's the famous lost colony of Roanoke. And John White, again, was the governor. He had left, and he kind of got basically trapped behind enemy lines during the invasion of the Spanish Armada. He was unable to get back to the colony, and that's part of why we don't know what happened to it, is because he was delayed several years in returning to check on them. It's his granddaughter, if anybody's ever heard of Virginia Dare, the first English child born in America was Virginia Dare. That was his granddaughter. But at any rate, John White supplies the illustrations based on the testimony of Captain John Smith and his own experiences in the Americas. This is actually the first version, so this is the one John Smith sent back his information even prior to his return. And so the first map that was published looked like this, a little different. And one important addition that we see on that first map is the coat of arms of Captain John Smith down here with those three Turkish heads. All right, the other thing I said I would talk to you a little bit about is in 1619, at the first gathering of the House of Burgesses. This is the first time that we have an elected assembly in Virginia. So we've had some self-government, but the council has always been appointed by the council back in London. So now the people are going to elect their own council, and an account of this first meeting is sent back to Edwin Sands and the other investors in London, and the account said, "But for as much as men's affairs do little prosper where God's service is neglected, all the Burgesses took their places in the choir, till a prayer was said by Mr. Buck, the minister, that it would please God to guide and sanctify all our proceedings to his own glory and the good of this plantation." Just another encouragement, you guys, of their understanding of what it was that they were about and how dependent they were on the good pleasure of God and focusing on bringing honor to him. This next slide is just really to remind you of the name of Edwin Sands. And I know that if we haven't written him down anywhere, guys, write him somewhere in the margins in that Jamestown, that section about changes in 1619. What's really important about Edwin Sands is that he has the vision of the Puritans, that dominion mandate, and the desire to keep moving the bar forward as far as individual liberties are concerned. He's working very diligently from London to establish what he believes is really the full expression of Puritan theology as it relates to the civil government. So what he's doing, his goal is to see that this colony is stocked with English families. He understands the importance. We've read, what he said about sending honestly educated maids to kind of root these men to the ground. So we need to stock the colony with English families that are then established on private estates where they are responsible for their own well-being, right? Then he wants them to have private property rights and their taxes determined by local representative government. So all along, throughout this time that Jamestown's established, he keeps moving that goal forward in the charters that he is instrumental in writing and having passed by King James. So they basically, what they're doing is transferring the authority of the London Company across the Atlantic. So where the London Company had been making the decisions, they are going to move that in 1619, and the base of decision making actually moves to the colony. And guys, this is huge. because that's what we're going to stand on now for years to come and say, you know, the rights of Englishmen came with us and the authority by charter came with us to the New World to engage in local representative government. So in other words, if the English king at any time decides that taxes are required of the colony, well, that's fine, but we have a local representative assembly that decides how those taxes will be collected. So it's not Parliament in England that's deciding this, it's our local representative body, because by charter we've been given the responsibility and the opportunity to govern ourselves. All right, enough said about that. Let's move on to the English separatists. So really quickly, I want you to understand the difference between a separatist and a Puritan. The separatists kind of break out of the Puritans. Remember here, we're still talking about like 1607 when the first settlers go to Jamestown. At that same time, where we're just 4 years into King James' reign. Some of you will know when the King James Bible was published, because we just celebrated the 400th anniversary. So it was 1611 when the King James Bible was published. So just to give you kind of that window of time, right? And King James is not a true Puritan. Remember, he's selected because when Queen Elizabeth dies with no heir, they are looking for the closest Protestant relative. But when he gets to town, everybody kind of realizes, okay, this guy's really not committed to individual liberties, for the civil government operating the way that it should, the rights of the people, etc. He's definitely a divine right of kings guy, and he asserts that pretty quickly. So the Puritans, who had hoped to continue to see lots of reform in the quote-unquote Church of England, and guys, when I say Anglican or Church of England, that's the same thing. So those that had hoped to see further reform in the Church of England, are now going to be very disappointed under King James, right? And King James says there's been enough reform. If anything, we're going to move back in the other direction. We're going to become more liturgical. We're going to add back some of the elements of the sacrament. And so this is alarming to the Puritans. Most of them are willing to hang in there and keep working to purify. So most of the Puritans, again, are going to hang in there. But we have a group of people that say our consciences will not allow us to continue to live under this. We've been commanded to worship in spirit and in truth. We're going to give an answer for how we have worshiped God when we die. And we will obey God rather than the king, rather than the tyrant king who is ordering us. I mean, again, they see it as like a Daniel moment, and they will not bow down to this idol. And so we have this small group of people that breaks away, and they're probably numbered in the hundreds, the high hundreds, guys. But again, I don't want you to think this is like thousands and thousands of people across England. They're a relatively small group. But they're it's another story just of God's faithfulness, guys, in using a remnant, just a little small group of hundreds of people to change the world. So let's fill in some blanks here. God will open a door of opportunity at a time when King James I was threatening persecution for all who would not strictly conform to the Anglican Church. So we have this small group of people that have started to meet apart from the Church of England, illegally, right? Okay, they can be prosecuted rather for this, and persecuted for that matter. Some of the penalties were lopping off your ear, or prison time. Well, they are meeting in the manor house of a gentleman who had previously worked in the court as a young man. He had worked in the court of Queen Elizabeth. So this is an educated person. I want you to understand that too. These are not just rabble rednecks from the countryside. A lot of these are the most highly educated folks. Some of the pastors were right out of Oxford University, and they've been studying that Geneva Bible, they've been reading that commentary, and so their thought processes are following Calvin and Luther and John Knox, and they want to live this out. Okay, so they're meeting in the manor house of a guy. His name is William Brewster. I'm going to give you that in the margin in just a minute. But his manor house is at a town called Scrooby. And the pastor is John Robinson. And I mentioned his name because we're going to talk about him again in just a minute. John Robinson, just upstanding, strong, faithful, long-suffering pastor of this group. They had been reading, there's the names. Okay, so Elder William Brewster, if you want to draw a little arrow over from his name, Elder William Brewster, to the manor house. He owns the manor house, so he's a fairly well-to-do person. The manor house is large, such that you can have a group meeting there, like 100 people can meet there. And then I also want you to write the name down here below, William Bradford. And just to keep them kind of separate, I know their names are similar, William Brewster, William Bradford. So William Brewster's the elder, meaning older, and he was, probably by like 40 years. William Bradford was just a lad, so Brad was the lad, right? Elder William Brewster and William Bradford. So their relationship is going to be one of a father figure, a mentor, and the reason behind that is that William Bradford, this young boy that lived near Scrooby, I'm going off my notes again here for a minute, you guys. But William Bradford is this young guy that lives nearby, and he has had a very interesting life. He's orphaned at the age of 6 or 7 years old. He was a sickly child. Two of his uncles, who were farmers nearby, took him in, but he was really too sick to work in the fields, and so they decided they would pay for him to be educated, thinking that this might be a good contribution to the family, somebody that knew how to do the books, that kind of thing. So he was privately educated, and he spends a lot of his time from age 7 to 11 at home and reading and studying. And he's not only studying bookkeeping and business, but he is also studying the Bible. And it's a Geneva Bible. And the more he reads, he also sees the errors that remain in the church, and he becomes more and more convicted about what's happening when, every Sunday when he attends the Church of England. Well, he hears rumors. This little kid hears about this local church body, and he basically beats a path to them. He sneaks off to go to church there. And from age, let me check my notes real quick. Between the ages of 12 and 14, he sporadically attended the church at Scrooby. And you can still go today to that area, and they have marked the path where William Bradford walked from his home, the farmhouse, over to the manor house to attend church. Pretty moving. And the manor house still stands. The manor house where those first Separatists were meeting under the leadership of John Robinson is still there, y'all. So this little guy is, again, age 12 to 14, he's beating a path over to the manor house and meeting with these Separatists. And over time, his uncles get really upset about this. And at age 14, when he says, I cannot attend the Church of England anymore, they're really fearful about repercussions on themselves. And so they disown him. And at age 14, William Bradford goes to live at the manor house with Elder William Brewster, where he continues to be trained and mentored, again, by a guy who had worked in the court of Queen Elizabeth. So he is taken under his wing. And later on, you guys, William Bradford, this young kid who joins the Pilgrims as a teenager, joins the Separatists as a teenager, he's going to become the longest running governor of the Plymouth colony. And he's going to keep immaculate records, just these very specific records of everything that happened to them from the time they were at Scrooby to their crossing of the English Channel, and they spend 13 years kind of in asylum in Holland, and then eventually they go to Plymouth. He tracks the whole history of the Separatists from the time in Scrooby all the way to his death. So it's this another amazing historical record. I think I've got pictures. Yes, this is his handwriting, and this is a record. He's talking about two English-speaking Indians who wander into the settlement there at Plymouth after their horrific winter where they've lost half of their number. God provides miraculously two local, friendly native peoples who speak their language. And then this is a full page that's taken from that document. Because he starts it, his chapter, he says at the top there, you see, of Plymouth Plantation. So this is kind of the story of how Plymouth Plantation came to be. And so the book today, if you want to buy a copy, you would look up Of Plymouth Plantation by William Bradford. And it's, again, a precious, precious resource that describes the early history and the planting of the Pilgrims and their vision in America. All right, back to this. So they've been reading their Geneva Bibles. The Geneva Bibles, of course, are the ones that Bloody Mary had inadvertently caused when her persecutions kind of chased all those English scholars over to Geneva. King James I really doesn't care necessarily what reforms they want. He will not tolerate defiance of his power, of his authority. And so the quote from him is, and we have this in the records, that he vowed, I will make them conform or harry them out of the land, or worse. Harry them out of the land, meaning chase them away, or worse. He believes strongly, obviously, in the divine right of kings, or D-R-O-K. So at this very moment, there's a war going on in the Netherlands, between the Netherlands and Spain. the Reformation had broken out in the Netherlands, and as you know, Spain is completely and totally Catholic. And under Philip II and his descendants, the Spanish have been ruthless in putting down any Protestantism in areas that they felt they were entitled to control. And the Netherlands had been a vassal state to Spain. So they had sent troops, and there's been a war going on for quite some time. It's called the 80 Years' War, but we're kind of in the middle of it right now. So obviously they don't fight all straight for 80 years. It's just on and off, on and off. Well, at this moment in time, the 80 Years' War suddenly ceased. There was a truce that was called. And the year, I forgot to pop it in here, it was 1607. It's the same year that those other settlers leave, those 104 men go to Jamestown. That same year, the Separatists go to Holland. That while they're there, they establish their own government, and they're able to practice that form of self-government for 13 years. Now, I don't mean they're not under the law of the Netherlands as well. They are, but this is more like church government, how they're going to govern themselves as a community. And so they live there, and they're practicing their faith, and they're practicing self-government within their church. Well, 13 years pass, and by 1620, the biggest concern is that they feel that Dutch society is influencing their children too much. They believe that it's drawing their children away from the faith, and they're very concerned. They believe, after much prayer and despite really some terrible reports that are coming back from the New World and from the English colonists there about some of the horrible abuses of the native peoples, etc., but yet they believe that they felt the call of God to go to the New World. They send a man named John Carver and a couple others back to London to negotiate with the London Company to see if they can't get a charter to go settle in the London Company's area. And they are granted a charter. Now, you guys remember we studied when we looked at the Virginia Charter of 1606 that the London Company was granted some area to the south and the Plymouth Company was granted this area to the north, but in the middle it overlapped, right? So when the Separatists asked for a place, their goal, they said the northern parts of Virginia, they wanted to go as far north as they could and still be in the London Company's area. Basically, they wanted to be sure they were really far away from Jamestown, okay? So Jamestown probably like down here. And they wanted to go as far north as they could and land about here at the 41st parallel. And the reason for that was they knew that Church of England was what was established in Jamestown, and they wanted to be as far away from that influence as possible so that they were not forced to participate in worship that they felt was inappropriate. And so William Bradford tells us in his journal that they left that good and pleasant city, which had been their resting place near 12 years, but they knew they were pilgrims, and they lifted up their eyes to the heavens, their dearest country, and quieted their spirits. Guys, this is how they come to be known as pilgrims. Pilgrims are travelers. But isn't it interesting, too, that they certainly do retain English customs, and they think it's very important to retain their English identity. But even more than that, I love what he says here, that even more than England, their dearest country was heaven. They lifted their eyes to the heavens, their dearest country, and quieted their spirits. They knew in whom they believed, and they would trust and follow God through much suffering. 5 years after they left, war resumes in the Netherlands. Just again, in the providence of God, he provided the perfect window of peace for the pilgrims.